The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge above the linoleum, a sound Danielle Ross had learned to tune out 3 years ago but never quite stopped hearing. 6 in the morning at Mercy General's ICU in Norfolk meant the night shift was bleeding into day shift, that brief window where exhaustion hung in the air like humidity before the real chaos began. She tied her hair back with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through the motion without conscious thought, and checked the assignment board. Room 12. Room 14. Room 18. The usual rotation for someone the day team didn't quite trust yet. Someone new. Someone without a voice. The long sleeves of her scrubs felt too warm already, but Danielle never rolled them up. 3 years meant people had stopped asking questions about the pale lines that traced the inside of her forearms like a map of somewhere she'd worked very hard to forget. She'd chosen this hospital because Norfolk was far enough from Walter Reed, far enough from the Pentagon District, far enough from anyone who might recognize the name Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. Here, she was just Danielle. Just a nurse. Just someone who showed up, did her job quietly, and disappeared at the end of her shift without making waves. The plan had always been simple. Heal. Say nothing. Survive. She was halfway through reading the overnight notes on her first patient when she noticed it, a jacket draped over the back of a chair outside room 12, navy blue with a Coast Guard insignia, and sewn into the lining of the collar was a patch. She stopped. Her breath caught in her chest like she'd been hit. The faded unit patch was visible for only a second before her eyes looked away, her training reasserting itself, don't stare, don't react, don't let anyone see that you saw. But her hands had gone still on the chart. That patch. Those colors. She knew exactly which unit that represented because she'd worn the same colors for 23 years before everything broke. Before her son died under its command. Danielle forced her hands to move again. Chart. Next room. Stay invisible. The morning rounds began at 6:30, and Dr. Hargrove swept through the ICU like a force of nature that the rest of the staff had learned to scatter around. He was tall, expensively dressed despite the white coat, with the kind of jaw that made nurses and residents fall silent when he spoke. His power wasn't just institutional, the attending physicians deferred to him, the hospital administration returned his calls within minutes, and his family name opened doors throughout Norfolk's medical hierarchy that most people would never even know existed. Danielle had observed all of this from a careful distance, the way she observed everything, as data, as threat assessment, as the constant calculation of how to exist in a space without being truly seen. Hargrove did see her, though. That was the problem. He paused at the nurse's station as he was pulling on his gloves, his eyes finding her over the rim of his wire-framed glasses with the kind of contempt usually reserved for something stuck to the bottom of a shoe. The civilian contract nurse, he said, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that made the morning shift go very quiet. Still with us, I see. Danielle didn't look up from her intake forms. Yes, doctor. That won't last, Hargrove said to the attending physicians who'd gathered around him like pilots around a briefing officer. Not with what's coming into room 12. He turned to face them fully, and something in his posture shifted. He was about to perform, and the performance was the point. 7-year-old. Mute. Hasn't spoken a word in 6 months. Mother died in a motor vehicle accident. The child's throat is fine, every specialist from Richmond to DC has cleared her physically. Which means she's what we call a hopeless case. Psychosomatic paralysis of the vocal cords. He turned and looked directly at Danielle. Tell you what, gentlemen. I'll wager $50 that the new girl quits within a week of dealing with that. She'll realize she's out of her depth and go back to whatever temp agency sent her. One of the residents laughed nervously. No one contradicted Hargrove. Danielle's jaw tightened. Her hand stilled on the chart she was holding, but she didn't look up. She'd learned long ago that reactions were currency. Give someone like Hargrove the satisfaction of seeing you affected, and they'd spend the rest of their tenure making sure you paid the price. She'd survived things worse than an insult in a hospital corridor. She'd survived things that would have broken most people into pieces. So she simply waited, counted to 3 in her head, the same count she'd used in Kandahar when incoming fire painted the sky overhead, and then she went back to reading her notes as if he hadn't spoken at all. Hargrove's expression darkened slightly. He didn't like being ignored. By 7 in the morning, Commander Mitchell had arrived, and the ICU's energy shifted in a way that Danielle felt immediately. Officers in full dress uniform had that effect. They carried authority the way other people carried breath. It was just part of how they moved through the world. He was standing in room 12 when Danielle approached with the morning vitals cart, and her first impression was of a man held together by something other than bones. His uniform was immaculate. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they found hers for a brief moment, carried the kind of exhaustion that only came from watching someone you loved disappear into themselves. Behind him, on the hospital bed with her small legs not quite reaching the edge of the mattress, sat Emma. The child was 7 years old, and she was silent in the way that silence became a presence, not the absence of sound but the presence of something else, something heavier. Her eyes tracked movement but didn't engage with it. She wore a hospital gown that hung loose on her small frame, and her hair had been braided that morning with the kind of care that only a parent who was still trying, still fighting, could manage. When Danielle entered, Emma looked away. "Good morning," Danielle said quietly. Not to the commander. To Emma. That was the first rule when children stopped speaking. You acknowledged them as the person, not as the medical problem. "I'm Danielle. I'm going to check your vitals this morning, and I promise it won't hurt. You're already doing the hardest part just by being here." Emma didn't respond. But her breathing changed slightly, became marginally less shallow. The chart told Danielle the story that specialists had already written: psychosomatic paralysis. Vocal cords functioning perfectly. No physical pathology. No lesions or inflammation or anything that medicine could cut out or medicate away. Just a little girl whose body had decided that speaking was more dangerous than silence, whose throat had closed up like a fist around the weight of losing her mother. The notes from the psychiatrist at Duke University Medical Center were damning in their helplessness. Recommend continued psychiatric care. Medical intervention unlikely to yield results. Hargrove had deemed her hopeless. But Danielle had learned a long time ago that hopelessness was just another word for "I don't know how to help," and those were different things entirely. The turning point came in the cafeteria at 11 in the morning, when Danielle was carrying her lunch tray back to the break room. She wasn't paying particular attention to her surroundings, a mistake, but one she'd gotten comfortable making because most people in the hospital left her alone if she didn't demand their attention. Hargrove, though, wasn't most people. He was walking past as she moved through the crowded cafeteria, and he moved with such deliberate precision that Danielle knew what was about to happen just slightly too late to prevent it. His arm came up and connected with her tray, and the entire thing went flying. Soup. Sandwich. Coffee. All of it scattered across the linoleum floor in front of 30 people, and the cafeteria went exactly as silent as it always did when Hargrove decided someone needed to understand their place. Danielle stood motionless for 2 seconds, her eyes on the mess, before she bent down to start picking up the pieces. "Leave it," Hargrove said, his voice carrying across the silence with perfect clarity. "The housekeeping staff will take care of that." He was already walking away, his posture radiating satisfaction. The message had been delivered: "You are beneath me. You are not worth my time. You will quit." Danielle finished picking up the larger pieces anyway. The second act began after morning rounds, when Hargrove found her at the nurse's station reviewing Emma's medical history. He dropped Emma's chart on the counter in front of her with enough force that it skidded across the polished surface and fell to the floor. When Danielle bent to pick it up, his voice cut through the moment like a scalpel. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, and the endearment was coated with enough contempt that it became a slur. "Maybe you'll find a miracle in there that actual doctors missed." The room was watching. This was becoming a thing now, Danielle understood. This was becoming performance art. She straightened, chart in hand, and something in her composed herself into a stillness so complete that the muscles around her eyes didn't even flicker. Her breathing stayed level. Her heart didn't race. She'd learned this skill in places where showing fear meant dying, and she'd maintained it through a psychiatric evaluation that had declared her emotionally unfit for continued service. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She looked at Hargrove directly for the first time that day. Her eyes were a shade of grey-blue that reminded people of a winter Atlantic, the kind of water that would kill you without apology. When she spoke, her voice didn't waver. "I've seen children survive worse than you could imagine, Doctor." The cafeteria had been one thing. This was different. This was Danielle speaking at all. The attending physicians exchanged glances. Even Hargrove seemed momentarily caught off guard. He'd expected deference, and instead he'd received something that looked a lot like a promise. He recovered quickly, forcing a smile that revealed nothing but his teeth, and then he walked away. But the game had changed now. And neither of them knew it yet. What nobody in the hospital understood, what nobody could possibly have understood because Danielle had spent 3 years making absolutely certain that no one would ever know, was that she was standing in the same ICU as the man who had ordered her son's unit into Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, in the summer of 2011. Lieutenant Mitchell had been the operations officer then. He'd been young and ambitious and absolutely certain of his own correctness, and he'd sent good soldiers into a place where good soldiers became dead soldiers. Danielle's boy had been one of them. She had joined the Coast Guard to be different from her son, to choose a service that was supposed to be about rescue and mercy instead of combat and fire. She'd risen through the ranks because she was brilliant at what she did, at keeping people alive when everything was conspiring to keep them dead. 23 years. 3 combat tours. Multiple tours through the VA hospital system as a nurse, because she'd needed to understand how broken men came back and why the system kept failing them. She'd left it all behind when the PTSD had finally made it impossible to pretend anymore, when the faces of the soldiers she couldn't save had started bleeding into her civilian life like contamination. She'd chosen to disappear instead. And now, by the random cruelty of assignment and chance, she was standing 3 doors away from the man whose orders had killed her son, and his daughter was locked behind a wall of silence so complete that it mirrored Danielle's own chosen invisibility. The child hadn't spoken in 6 months. Danielle hadn't let herself feel anything in 3 years. And somehow, in the way that fate operated when nobody was looking, they'd been placed in the same room. That wasn't coincidence. That was the universe asking a question. The only thing Danielle didn't know yet was whether she had the strength to answer it, or whether answering it would cost her everything she'd worked so hard to keep hidden. The morning rounds began at 6:52, and Dr. Hargrove assembled his entourage like a general positioning troops before battle. For residents in short white coats, 2 attending physicians, all of them trailing behind him as he stopped outside Emma's room with the deliberate precision of someone who'd rehearsed the moment in his mind. Danielle was adjusting the foreline on the child's left hand when she heard his voice carry through the doorway, not loud enough to seem unprofessional, but loud enough that everyone in the corridor would hear every word. "This child presents with psychosomatic paralysis of the vocal cords," Hargrove announced, his tone the clinical drawl of a man accustomed to being the smartest voice in any room. "Every specialist from Johns Hopkins to Walter Reed has examined her. Mother died 6 months ago in a motor vehicle collision. Father's a Coast Guard commander, discipline-oriented, which explains the child's likely conversion disorder. This isn't medicine. This is psychiatry wearing a hospital gown." He paused. Danielle kept her hand steady on the 4, feeling the weight of attention shifting toward her like a spotlight. But Nurse Ross here seems to believe her community college certification somehow trumps actual medical degrees. Hargrove gestured dismissively, his fingers flicking as though swatting away an insect. "I'm sure she means well." The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a 3rd year named Peterson, allowed himself a thin smile. Emma's eyes widened slightly, tracking the shift in the room's energy. Danielle finished securing the 4-port, smoothed the tape with methodical precision, then turned to face the gathered doctors. One measured breath. She felt the burn of humiliation climbing her spine like a fever, but her face remained composed. A single tear formed at the corner of her left eye. She blinked it away before it could fall, her gaze dropping to Emma's monitor as though the pulse oximeter had suddenly become the most important object in existence. She said nothing. Walking out would be worse than staying. Speaking would be worse than silence. Hargrove's smile widened, the smile of a man who'd just watched his prey fail to fight back. 7 hours later, the cafeteria at Mercy General was at full capacity. 1:30 in the afternoon meant the lunch rush, doctors and nurses and residents all converging on the salad bar and sandwich station like predators at a watering hole. Danielle carried her tray, turkey sandwich, apple, bottled water, toward an empty table near the eastern windows. The doctor's section occupied the prime real estate by the glass, overlooking the parking garage and the Norfolk skyline beyond. She passed within 4 feet of their table. That's when she heard the scrape of a chair sliding backward. Hargrove's shoe, Italian leather, expensive, deliberate, extended directly into her path. Danielle's boot caught the edge. The tray tilted. For a moment that lasted an eternity, she watched the laws of physics betray her. The sandwich slid. The apple rolled. The water bottle fell, and soup, tomato bisque, still steaming, crashed across the tile floor in a red, spreading bloom. The cafeteria went silent. Every head turned. 23 doctors and nurses watched a nurse on her knees with paper towels, cleaning up her own destruction while the man who'd caused it didn't apologize. Didn't move. Didn't even pretend it had been an accident. "Careful, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the casual menace of a rattlesnake settling into its coil. "Wouldn't want you dropping something important." Like a patient. Laughter rippled through the doctor's section. Peterson was grinning. Even one of the attendings, Dr. Chen, who Danielle had always respected, looked away rather than meet her eye. The unspoken hierarchy had been re-established. Danielle was not one of them. She would never be one of them. She knelt there, gathering fragments of her lunch, feeling the weight of their contempt like a physical force pressing down on her shoulders. One tear escaped before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her gaze fixed on the floor, her jaw clenched so tightly she could feel her molars grinding. The trembling didn't start until later, it always waited until she was alone, but the impulse to tremble was there now, pushing at her composure like water behind a weakening dam. By 3 that afternoon, the incident had already been absorbed into the hospital's informal mythology. By 4, Hargrove had moved to his final escalation of the day. Emma's chart landed on the tile floor outside her room like a discarded paperback, pages scattering across the hallway in a chaos of medical documentation and test results. Danielle was carrying fresh linens when it happened. Hargrove stood in the doorway, one hand still extended from the throw, his expression a mixture of contempt and satisfaction. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice smooth as a blade. "Maybe you'll find a miracle in there that actual doctors missed." For 3 seconds, Danielle didn't move. The linens felt heavy in her arms. The hallway felt longer than it was. She could feel the shift happening inside her, the civilian persona being tested by something older, something trained, something that remembered how to respond to direct provocation in an environment where hesitation meant death. She set the linens on the nearest chair. Crouched slowly, deliberately, gathering the scattered pages with methodical precision. Each sheet. Each order. Each test result. Each moment of professional documentation scattered across hospital tile by a man whose institutional power had granted him the luxury of contempt. She stood, holding the reassembled chart against her chest, and met his eyes directly. One measured breath. She wiped the corner of her eye with her thumb, a gesture small enough to pass for a natural reaction to stress, devastating enough to communicate everything a combat-trained nurse understood about emotional control. Her voice, when it came, was quiet. Calm. Stripped of every apology the hospital had trained her to offer. "I've seen children survive worse than you could imagine, doctor." It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was something worse than both. It was the sound of someone speaking from experience that Hargrove couldn't measure against his credentials, and for just a second, his smile faltered. His jaw tightened. Something flickered in his eyes, not quite fear, but the moment of uncertainty that precedes fear. Then he turned and walked away, and Danielle stood in the hallway holding Emma's chart, feeling the weight of what she'd just revealed without saying a single thing about her past. The supply closet on the third floor was empty at 4:45. Danielle locked the door behind her and let her hands shake. The tremor started in her palms and climbed through her wrists, her forearms, her shoulders, all the restraint she'd maintained through morning rounds and the cafeteria and the hallway confrontation now releasing like pressure escaping a compromised seal. She gripped the edge of the utility sink, her knuckles whitening, and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes of loss of composure. 4 minutes. No more. When she emerged at 4:50, her scrubs were fresh, she'd changed in the break room, and her voice was steady. But the calculation had already begun. Hargrove was dangerous. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what he'd almost made her do. The professional hierarchy at Mercy General wasn't built for people like her. The moment she revealed too much, the moment someone recognized the weight beneath the civilian facade, everything would unravel. She needed to be invisible again. Compliant again. Just a nurse. That night, the ICU was operating at 32% capacity. Emma's room was on the western corridor, and most of the staff had consolidated around the eastern monitors. Danielle finished her assigned tasks, for checks on 3 other patients, documentation updates, medication reconciliation, by 10:45. Her original duty rotation had been Emma's primary care nurse, but that had changed yesterday when Hargrove's reassignment came through, new patients, different floor section, Emma's care transferred to Rodriguez, a rotating float nurse who saw her twice a shift. Rodriguez was competent. That wasn't the problem. Danielle completed her paperwork at the central station, clocked out officially at 11, then made her way back toward Emma's room using the access routes that paralleled the main corridors, the maintenance hallway that connected the supply areas, the path past the physical therapy offices, the route that wouldn't show on any official floor patrol log. Emma was awake. The child sat propped against 3 pillows, her small frame barely creating an indent in the hospital bed, her eyes tracking the monitor that displayed her heart rate and oxygen saturation. When Danielle appeared in the doorway, Emma's hand made a small movement, not quite a wave, but an acknowledgement. Danielle pulled the visitor's chair close enough that she could sit without being visible from the main corridor. She didn't try to make Emma talk. She'd learned that in the first encounter, the child's silence wasn't stubbornness. It was a fortress, and you didn't breach fortresses by battering the gates. You waited for them to open. Instead, she told stories. When I was younger, Danielle said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Emma could hear, I knew a boy about your age. 8 years old. He stopped speaking for a whole year. Not because he couldn't. Because speaking meant remembering things that hurt too much. Emma's eyes stayed fixed on the monitor. One day, he heard music. Not sad music. Not the kind of music that makes you feel like someone understands your pain. Music that just made him want to move. To exist in the moment instead of carrying around all that weight. Danielle paused. He started humming along. Just humming at first. Then singing one word. Then a whole sentence. The words came back because the weight got lighter. She didn't say that the boy was her son. She didn't say that his loss had nearly destroyed her. She simply left the story there, a seed planted in the dark, and they sat together in the soft glow of hospital monitors while the rest of Mercy General moved on around them. Over the next week, the pattern established itself. Danielle completed her reassigned duties with methodical efficiency. She changed dressings on her assigned patients. She documented her observations. She clocked out. And then, using the maintenance hallways and the blind spots in the surveillance system, she returned to Emma's room during the long hours of night shift when the ICU grew quiet and the hospital felt like it belonged to the ghosts of everyone who'd come before. Emma began to respond. Small nods. The squeeze of a hand. Once, a sound, not quite a word, but something that lived in the space between silence and speech. Danielle noted everything in the margins of her own personal journal, not in Emma's official chart. Evidence that couldn't be discovered. Progress that existed only in the private space between a nurse and a frightened child. On the 8th night, Commander Mitchell arrived for a late visit and found Danielle reading aloud from a children's book, Emma's hand resting on her arm. Mitchell's shoulders tensed. He didn't recognize her face. She'd been careful to avoid direct contact, always positioning herself so that he saw only her profile or her hands. But he saw the intimacy of the moment, and something shifted in his expression. Concern. Curiosity. A flicker of something else Danielle couldn't quite identify. "She's responding well to her," Mitchell said to Rodriguez, who'd appeared to check vitals. "Better than I've seen since," he stopped. "Since her mother." Rodriguez nodded, documenting her findings, unaware that the real work had been happening in the hours when there was no documentation, no official record, no institutional acknowledgement. Just a woman who'd seen children break and understood how gently you had to hold the pieces while they healed. That was when Mitchell mentioned the chest pain. "She's been complaining about discomfort here," he said, pointing to Emma's left ribcage. But Dr. Hargrove examined her and said it was anxiety-related bruising from when she tensed up during the physical exam. Danielle's hand stilled on the book. She asked to see. Emma lifted her hospital gown, and there it was, asymmetric bruising across the left anterior chest wall, not the diffuse discoloration of anxiety muscle tension. This was localized. Concentrated. The kind of bruising that came from blunt force trauma or from a rib fracture. Possible tension pneumothorax if the fracture had been sharp enough to penetrate the pleural space. Danielle's combat-trained instincts, honed across for years of running trauma operations in Kandahar, screamed warnings that her civilian facade couldn't acknowledge. She kept her face neutral. "Has Dr. Hargrove ordered imaging?" "He said it wasn't necessary," Mitchell replied. "That it was anxiety-related." Danielle excused herself, walked to the nearest computer terminal, and typed a request for Dr. Hargrove to order a chest X-ray. The response came back within 90 seconds via hospital message system: "Stop wasting radiology's time with your paranoia. Hargrove." She took a screenshot. Documented the timestamp. Made a quiet note in Emma's chart with her own clinical observations about the asymmetric bruising pattern and her clinical recommendation for imaging. The note was dated, timestamped, and witnessed by the electronic system. If something happened to Emma, there would be a record that Danielle had flagged the risk. It wouldn't protect her from Hargrove's retaliation, but it might protect Emma. That night, in the parking garage, Danielle sat in her car for 40 minutes. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the faded unit patch, olive drab fabric worn soft by time, the emblem of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines barely visible in the dim light of the garage. Her son had worn this patch. She'd removed it from the jacket lining in her apartment 3 days ago, carried it with her like a talisman or a curse. Marcus. Dead in Kandahar at 22 years old. Dead under the command of a man whose daughter now lay in a hospital bed, breathing through a potential fracture, while the doctor overseeing her care refused to order the imaging that might save her life. The universe had a cruel sense of geometry. It placed pieces on the board and waited to see what you would do when the rules of civility conflicted with the rules of survival. Danielle returned to the ICU at 2 in the morning. No one questioned her presence. She'd worked enough shifts that her ID badge granted her access, and the night staff was thin, spread across multiple floors. Emma was sleeping, her small chest rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Danielle checked the monitors. Oxygen saturation 94%. Heart rate steady. No signs of respiratory distress. Not yet. She pulled the visitor's chair close and waited in the dark, understanding that she'd crossed a line somewhere between professional duty and something older, something that had nothing to do with hospital policy and everything to do with a woman who'd held dying soldiers in her arms and had made a silent oath that she would never, ever let institutional indifference decide another person's fate. Not on her watch. The monitor alarm screamed at 03 for 7 hours. Not a warning beep. Not a gentle notification. A full cardiac alert, the kind of sound that stops time in a hospital, the kind that makes every nerve-ending fire at once. Danielle was at the nurse's station reviewing discharge paperwork when the alarm split the night air like a siren, and she was moving before the second beep sounded. Room for 12. Emma. The chart said anxiety-related bruising from the car accident. The chart said psychosomatic paralysis of the vocal cords. The chart said a 7-year-old girl whose trauma was emotional, not physical, not something that required immediate intervention at 3 in the morning. The chart was wrong. Danielle hit the room at a sprint. Emma was gasping, her small body rigid against the mattress, her lips already turning that particular shade of blue that meant oxygen wasn't reaching her lungs anymore. The monitor showed a heart rate climbing, 142, 156, 168, and her chest was doing that terrible thing where only one side was rising and falling. The trachea was deviated to the right. The breath sounds on the left side were absent. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung that was compressing her heart, killing her, and doing it in real time. The on-call resident was 3 floors down in the ICU. The attending physician who dismissed the chest trauma as anxiety-related was asleep at home. Nobody was coming. Not in time. Not in the 90 seconds Emma had before cardiac arrest became inevitable. Danielle's conscious mind registered all of this in the space of one breath. Her hands were already moving. Muscle memory doesn't forget. It lives in your fingers, in your shoulders, in the place behind your sternum where fear and training become the same thing. She'd been Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross for 12 years. She'd stood in Kandahar surgical tents with incoming casualties arriving faster than beds could be prepped, with blast wounds and shrapnel wounds and wounds that didn't have names yet, with soldiers whose lives depended on her hands moving faster than panic. That woman didn't exist anymore. That woman was buried under 3 years of civilian life and scrubs and the careful performance of humility. That woman came roaring back. She grabbed the emergency kit from the wall, hand steady as a surgical laser, movements precise as a combat choreography she'd never truly unlearned. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol prep pad. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd done this in darkness, in rain, in the back of a transport helicopter with rounds going overhead. She could do it in her sleep. Emma's eyes were wide, terrified, rolling white at the edges. The child tried to speak and couldn't get air, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but suffocate in increments. Danielle's voice dropped an octave, the tone shifting from gentle night shift nurse to something older, something that had commanded rooms full of combat medics. I've got you. Stop fighting the pain. Breathe shallow. She felt for the anatomical landmarks, the third rib, the space below it, the exact point where needle met flesh and lung could finally release its terrible pressure. The alcohol pad smelled sharp, clinical, a scent that took her backward to operating tables lit by chemical lanterns and the sound of helicopter blades overhead. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation was how people died. The needle went in. There was a moment of resistance, tissue giving way to steel, and then the most beautiful sound in medicine, the hiss of air escaping. The pneumothorax releasing. 3 seconds of that rushing, whistling release, like all the pressure in the world finally had somewhere to go. Emma's color changed first. The blue receding from her lips. Her chest rising and falling on both sides now, symmetrical, alive. The monitor began its descent, 156, 142, 128, 114, the rhythm stabilizing into something that wasn't cardiac arrest, something that was going to survive the night. Danielle kept one hand on the needle, kept her breathing steady, kept her mind in the room and not in Kandahar, not in the moment 16 years ago when she'd held a soldier whose name was Marcus and whose chest had stopped moving no matter how many times she compressed it. Emma was breathing. Emma was stable. Emma was going to live. Get me a chest tube set up. Now. The voice that came out wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind that made residents move without thinking, the kind that came from someone who'd stood in operating theaters and made life-and-death decisions under fire. A nurse, not Danielle, someone from the night shift, appeared in the doorway, took one look at the procedure, and ran. The attending physician was being called. The resident was on his way up. Danielle stayed with Emma, her hand steady on the needle, her presence a weight in the room that said, I'm here. I won't leave. You are not alone. The resident arrived in 4 minutes. The attending in 7. They saw the decompression, the stabilized vitals, the child whose color had returned to normal human instead of the blue-gray of hypoxia. They saw Danielle standing there like she'd been born in trauma rooms, like this was the language she spoke naturally. Tension pneumothorax, she said quietly. Undiagnosed chest injury from the accident. Progressive deterioration. Decompressed at 0349. 2 liters O2, SpO2 now 94% and climbing. The attending looked at the needle, at the procedure tray, at Danielle. His eyes sharpened with understanding. He nodded, a small gesture, but it was recognition. She'd saved the child's life. Not theory. Not protocol. Actual, immediate, undeniable intervention that had meant the difference between Emma breathing and Emma not breathing. The chest tube was placed. The portable X-ray confirmed a pneumothorax, significant but controlled, with the needle decompression having bought them the time they needed for proper surgical management. Emma was stable. Her vitals were normal. Her oxygen saturation was climbing toward 98%. And then Commander Mitchell arrived. He came through the doors still in civilian clothes, having been called from the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, where he'd been waiting for some kind of news, any news, about his daughter. His face was the particular shade of white that comes from a parent being told their child is in crisis. He took in the room in one glance, the chest tube set up, the monitor showing clean sinus rhythm, his daughter breathing, her color restored. His eyes found Danielle. You saved her life. It wasn't a question. It was something older than gratitude, something that came from a man who understood exactly what those 90 seconds had meant, who'd stood in enough combat situations to know what the difference between competence and panic looked like. His voice cracked like a dam breaking. You saved her life. Danielle only nodded. There were no words that fit. Words belonged to the civilian world, to explanations and disclaimers. What had happened in that room existed beyond language. 20 minutes later, Dr. Hargrove arrived. His hair was disheveled from sleep, his expression already hostile, called away from his bed at 3 in the morning by a routine emergency that should have been handled by residents. He was the kind of angry that comes from disrupted sleep and the gnawing certainty that something interesting had happened without him, that his authority had been sidestepped. He took one look at the procedure tray. His eyes lit up with the particular joy of a predator who's finally found the opening he's been waiting for. He moved to the chart, read the notes, looked at the timeline. 3 minutes. The decompression had been performed 3 minutes before the resident arrived. The procedure had been done by Danielle Ross, civilian nurse, without physician supervision, without explicit authorization, in a situation where protocol said she should have called for help and waited. He looked at her the way a shark looks at blood in the water. You performed a needle decompression. His voice was quiet, almost pleasant. That's a procedure beyond your scope of practice, Nurse Ross. That is a physician-level intervention. You've just committed, he paused, savoring the moment, a significant breach of hospital policy. I believe you understand what that means. Danielle's jaw tightened. That was the only sign. No trembling. No fear. Just a slight hardening of the muscles at the hinge of her face, like something granite settling into place. Hargrove pulled out his phone. First call, the hospital board president, a man named Sterling who'd been Hargrove's roommate at Yale and who picked up even at 3 in the morning because you answer when a Yale brother calls. Hargrove's voice was smooth as oil, regretful, like a man delivering terrible news he wished he didn't have to share. We have a situation, he said. One of the nurses in my ICU performed an unauthorized procedure on a pediatric patient. Needle decompression. Without supervision. I'm going to need legal. Second call, the temp agency that had placed Danielle 3 years ago. The owner answered on the 8th ring, already hostile. Hargrove's tone shifted, became threatening, became the voice of a man with institutional power and access to lawyers. I'm investigating a potential criminal negligence situation involving one of your placements. Danielle Ross. I need her complete employment history, And I'm telling you right now that if you don't cooperate fully, my hospital's legal team will be filing charges for fraud. You have 1 hour. He hung up and looked at Danielle with a smile that wasn't quite a smile. You're going to wish you'd quit when I told you to. By 05:45 hours, an outside investigator had been called. By 06:30, a file had been opened. By 07:45, Danielle had been called to the administrator's office and informed that she was being suspended pending review for performing a procedure outside her scope of practice on a pediatric patient. The words were formal, neutral, but they landed like grenades. The security guard who escorted her out was the same man who'd seen her come in every day for 3 years. He didn't meet her eyes as he handed her the box for her belongings. Scrubs, stethoscope, the faded unit patch she kept in her pocket, the one she'd sewn into a jacket lining years ago, the one that had belonged to a unit that didn't exist anymore, to a life that had ended in Kandahar with a name she couldn't speak without her hand shaking. She walked past room for 12 on the way out. Emma was sleeping, her small body connected to machines, her chest rising and falling steadily because Danielle had intervened. The child's eyes opened. Confusion registered first, then recognition, then something that looked like fear as she watched Danielle being escorted away by security. Danielle mouthed one word, "Okay." It wasn't true. It wasn't okay. But it was what you said to a child who'd already lost too much. Dr. Hargrove made the call at 08:05 hours on a Tuesday morning, his office door closed, his voice steady as surgical steel. The hospital board president answered on the second ring. They went back to Yale, back to fraternity dinners and country club memberships, back to a network built on handshakes and favors owed. Hargrove didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We have a liability nightmare," he said, and the words came like a prosecutor building a case. A civilian nurse performed an emergency procedure she had no authorization to execute. Needle decompression on a pediatric patient. She compromised chain of command, violated scope of practice, and now we're exposed to $1 million lawsuit if that child's lung tissue shows complications from her amateur intervention. The board president listened. Hargrove painted the picture with surgical precision. One wrong detail from a temp agency nurse could bankrupt the institution, could bring state licensing boards down on administration, could trigger an investigation that would unravel every hiring protocol Mercy General had in place. By the end of the call, Hargrove didn't need to ask for anything. The board president promised to call the nursing director. Just like that. But that wasn't the worst part. 40 minutes later, Hargrove was on the phone with the temp agency that had placed Danielle 6 months prior. He didn't introduce himself as her supervisor, he introduced himself as hospital counsel, which was technically false, but the lie carried weight because he said it like someone accustomed to being believed. "I need her complete employment history," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Full references, previous positions, military service dates if applicable, any gaps in her background. We're investigating an unauthorized medical procedure and we need everything." The temp agency manager hesitated. Hargrove's voice dropped lower, colder. "If you don't provide those records voluntarily, I'll file a complaint with the state labor board alleging negligent hiring practices. I'll subpoena your entire file on this employee. And I'll make sure every hospital in Virginia knows that your agency places staff without proper vetting." The threat wasn't explicit, but it didn't need to be. Within an hour, Hargrove had a forwarded email containing Danielle's minimal background check, gaps everywhere, military service listed but no specifics, references from places that no longer existed or wouldn't return calls. The investigator arrived at 0700 on Thursday morning, a woman named Judith Crane from an outside firm that specialized in medical liability cases. She was thorough in the way people are when their job depends on finding problems. She reviewed the medical record. She reviewed the procedure log. She interviewed the ER staff who had witnessed the needle decompression, and most of them, nervous about their own positions, confirmed that yes, a non-credentialed nurse had performed an advanced procedure. Some said she'd saved Emma's life. Others, sensing the political wind shifting, suddenly remembered that Danielle had acted without requesting supervision first. By noon, Crane met with the nursing director. By 1400 hours, Danielle received the suspension letter. Effective immediately. Pending full investigation. Access to the hospital suspended until further notice. Security escorted her out at 1,530 hours. Not unkindly. The guard, a man named Torres who had seen Danielle bring coffee to night shift nurses and help residents find their way to the bathroom, walked her through the corridor where she'd held Emma's hand 3 nights ago. Other nurses watched. Some looked away. Some looked at her the way people look at a soldier coming back from a war that no one else understands. She carried a cardboard box containing her stethoscope, her pocket reference guide, and a shift schedule that would never be filled. The rain had started that afternoon, the kind of Norfolk rain that came off the Atlantic with teeth, and by the time Torres handed her the box at the employee exit, the weather had turned mean. She didn't go home. Instead, she drove to Riverside Cemetery on Magnolia Avenue, parked in the empty lot, and walked until she found the headstone that read Marcus Ross, Navy Corpsman, 1991 to 2019. The grave was on a slope facing the river, and the rain hammered the ground around it like artillery, like the sound of helicopters, like every noise that had ever meant someone she loved was about to disappear. Danielle knelt in the mud. The cardboard box sat beside her, slowly absorbing water. She pressed her hands against the cold granite, and for the first time since the needle had gone into Emma's chest, since the moment she'd saved that child's life and watched it destroy her own, she let her composure crack. "I found the daughter of the man whose orders killed our son," she whispered, her voice swallowed by rain. "I couldn't even save her without losing everything. I failed you, Marcus. I failed you." She stayed there for an hour, kneeling in the mud while the storm passed overhead, while her jacket soaked through and her hands went numb. She had left the military 8 years ago when the PTSD became something she couldn't function with anymore, couldn't sleep through, couldn't survive in a uniform anymore. She had walked away from a community that was everything to her, from a rank that had meant something, from an identity that had defined her every waking hour. She had chosen anonymity instead. A quiet nursing job. No one asking questions. No one knowing that Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, who had run combat surgical operations in Kandahar for 4 years, who had trained corpsmen that half the SEAL teams in the Middle East depended on, was now wiping bedpans and checking vitals on a pediatric ward. She hadn't even told her sister where she was or what she'd done. That was the secret she'd kept closest, not just the military past, but the whole architecture of it, the medals, the operations, the weight of the lives she'd held together with her own 2 hands while bullets came through the tent walls. And now it was all coming apart because she'd saved a child. The next 3 days dissolved into the machinery of investigation. The temp agency's background check revealed the gaps, years where she'd worked with no civilian address listed, locations that sounded military but no explanation attached, reference checks that went nowhere because some people and some places weren't meant to be verified. The outside investigator found the inconsistencies. Dr. Hargrove made sure every board member heard about them. He called in favors like a man spending down his entire portfolio of privilege. A Yale connection on the hospital board. An attorney friend who specialized in medical liability. Committee meetings held with expressions of concern and whispered conversations about protecting the institution. The network he activated was vast and efficient, the kind of network that comes from being born into the right family and going to the right schools and knowing which hands to shake when the sun goes down. Meanwhile, Emma remained in pediatric ICU, her vital signs stable, her voice still silent. She started leaving messages in a small notepad, drawings mostly, but one that read "Where is Miss Danielle?" in careful block letters. Commander Mitchell requested that Danielle be allowed to visit. The nursing director said she was suspended and couldn't have contact with patients. He pulled rank. It didn't matter. This was civilian hospital administration, not the Coast Guard, and his uniform meant nothing in the hallways of Mercy General. Hargrove made sure of it, reassigning Emma to a different nurse, flagging any request related to Danielle in the system, even restricting her building access in case she tried to visit on her own time. On the morning of the 3rd day, the termination letter arrived. Not suspension anymore. Termination. Effective immediately. for violation of scope of practice, unauthorized medical procedures, and failure to follow proper chain of command. The letter was written with legal precision and emotional nothing. Danielle sat in her empty apartment, the faded unit patch on her kitchen table beside Marcus's folded flag, and watched the rain return to Norfolk. She thought about Emma asking for her in a notepad. She thought about the child sitting in a hospital bed, having lost her voice once already, now losing the only adult who had bothered to listen to her silence. And she realized, sitting there in the grey afternoon light, that she had nothing left to lose anymore. Her job was gone. Her identity was compromised. The one child who had trusted her was slipping away behind hospital protocols and Dr. Hargrove's careful orchestration. She decided to go to the hospital one final time, knowing security would likely arrest her for trespassing, knowing she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and not caring anymore because the only thing worse than losing everything was not saying goodbye to the person who mattered most. The hospital corridor at 1,447 hours carried the smell of antiseptic and something else, hope, maybe, or the ghost of it. Danielle had decided to come back anyway, trespassing or not, because Emma deserved to know that someone didn't give up. She wasn't sure what she'd say. Wasn't sure security wouldn't escort her out the same way they'd escorted her in, 2 days prior, with a cardboard box holding 3 years of her life. She was pushing through the ER double doors when the translator collapsed. 50 years old. Afghan. Admitted through triage with an acute anterior MI, a myocardial infarction, the paperwork would say later. Chest pain radiating down the left arm. Diaphoresis. Heart rate 118. The ER team scrambled him into Bay 3, and Danielle stepped aside to let them work, her muscle memory recognizing the choreography of a code even as her mind tried to process that she wasn't part of it anymore. She was nobody here now. Just a woman in street clothes standing in a hallway that didn't belong to her. The translator's stretcher hadn't made it more than 30 feet when his head turned. His oxygen mask slipped. His eyes found her across the crowded ER floor with the precision of a homing missile, and everything in his face changed. He was trying to stand. The nurses were holding him down. Senior Chief Ross, he called out, his voice thin and fractured through the mask. Senior Chief Ross, the Angel of Kandahar. The room didn't go dead silent. It went something worse than that. It went uncertain. Nurses exchanged glances. A resident froze mid-stride. Dr. Hargrove, who had been standing near Bay 2, turned with the expression of a man watching his constructed world begin to develop cracks. Danielle didn't move. Didn't acknowledge him. Didn't let the trembling that suddenly moved through her hands show anywhere else. But Emma heard it. The girl was sitting in the plastic chair outside the family consultation room, where Commander Mitchell had left her 30 minutes ago while he spoke with the attending physician about her latest progress notes. She'd been reading a book. Hospital rules, children weren't permitted in active ER bays, so she waited, as she always did, in the liminal space between the adult's world and her own small one. She stood up. "You're a senior chief." That voice. 6 months of silence, and now that voice, still small, still fragile, but present. Present like a child's hand reaching for solid ground. Emma's eyes were locked on Danielle's, asking the question that had been building beneath the surface of every story, every quiet moment in the hallway, every time Danielle had smoothed the girl's hair back from her forehead. Danielle moved toward her. Not toward the translator. Not toward the gathering medical staff. Toward Emma. She pushed into the consultation room, empty, the chair still warm where Commander Mitchell had sat, and pulled out Emma's file. 3 years of her daughter's life, condensed to paper and notes and assessments. Intake forms. Psychiatric evaluations. Neurological imaging. Speech pathology reports that all said the same thing, functional, not organic. The damage was in the mind, not the throat. Her hands moved on their own. The file was old, the kind that lived in the physical record room because Emma had been admitted before full digitization. Danielle's fingers found the back flap, the one where documents sometimes slipped between the cardboard backing and the manila exterior. Where secrets lived. She felt it before she saw it. The patch was faded, the threading worn where it had been pulled from hundreds of uniforms over the course of many lives. It was her son's unit patch. 1st Special Operations Squadron. The insignia that had meant everything, meant home, meant purpose, meant a future that would never arrive. Her hands did tremble then. She couldn't stop them. Underneath, in Commander Mitchell's handwriting, a note folded small as a prayer: "Your son saved 3 lives before he saved mine." The words didn't make sense. The words made too much sense. Marcus had died covering a retreat. Marcus had died in Kandahar on a Tuesday that had no business ending the way it did. Marcus had been 24 years old, and his commanding officer had never once told her how her son had died, only that he had, and then there had been a funeral with a flag that stayed folded, and then there had been nothing but the shape of his absence. Emma appeared in the doorway. "Mama didn't come back," the girl said quietly. "But you did." Danielle couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but hold that patch like it might dissolve in her hands if she loosened her grip. That Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross. The voice came from the corridor behind Emma, not a question, a statement. A tall man in civilian clothes but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent decades in uniform. "Navy SEAL," the posture said. The eyes said. The confidence that came from having survived things the comfortable world couldn't imagine. He was looking at her with recognition that bordered on reverence. 2 Navy Crosses. A Silver Star. She ran the most advanced combat surgical unit in Kandahar for 4 years. Saved more lives in that theater than anyone I've ever known. He paused, and the hallway seemed to understand that it should listen. That's the Angel of Kandahar. Dr. Hargrove had gone the color of diluted milk. He was still standing by Bay 2, his hands at his sides, his constructed narrative collapsing like a building imploding from the inside. Every word he'd spoken about her. Every dismissal, every bet, every moment he'd thrown her incompetence in her face. All of it, disintegrating. The administrator appeared from the stairwell with the outside investigator in tow. One look at the SEAL, one look at Danielle holding that unit patch, one look at the Afghan translator who was being stabilized in Bay 3 and kept repeating Senior Chief between oxygen breaths, and the administrator understood. "Dr. Hargrove. My office. Now." It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the weight of institutional authority, and Hargrove moved because there was nothing else he could do. The SEAL followed. The investigator followed. The board members who had voted to terminate Danielle based on his recommendations, based on his credibility, based on his Yale connections and his carefully cultivated reputation, they were being called back in remotely. The meeting would happen in the administrator's conference room in 7 minutes. Danielle knelt in front of Emma, the unit patch still trembling in her hands. "I came back," she said. "I said I would. Will you stay?" The question hung between them, impossibly heavy for a 7-year-old to ask, impossibly simple for Danielle to answer. "If they'll let me." The administrator passed the open conference room door 20 minutes later and gestured for Danielle to join them. She had Emma by the hand. Commander Mitchell was already inside, standing near the window, his face a study in grief and hope colliding at exactly the same moment. The SEAL was mid-sentence, describing operations that had been classified until this moment but needed to be unclassified now. The investigator was reviewing the needle decompression procedure, the technique, the indication, the outcome. Every medical board in the nation, he stated clearly, would have made the same call. It wasn't scope of practice violation. It was the application of training that had saved a child's life. Hargrove's voice was climbing higher, more desperate. Liability. Civilian protocols. The distinction between military and hospital procedure. His words scrambled over each other like a man drowning in his own narrative. You suspended a decorated Navy senior chief for saving a child's life with a battlefield procedure she was trained to perform. The board president's voice came through the video feed cold as January. "I was protecting the hospital," Hargrove said. "You were protecting yourself," the administrator said quietly. And you did it by attacking the one person in this building who actually knew how to save that child. The Yale connection didn't matter anymore. The phone calls he'd made now became calls made under false pretenses. The temp agency he'd threatened was reviewing his coercion. The board members who had approved his recommendations were now reviewing his conduct. By the time the meeting concluded, Dr. James Hargrove was suspended pending his own investigation. The irony would have been funny if the stakes hadn't been so profound. Commander Mitchell approached Danielle when the formal meeting ended. His hands were shaking. "Your son died covering our retreat. He took fire meant for me. I've carried that weight every day for 3 years. I kept his patch because it was all I had of the bravest kid I ever commanded." He couldn't finish. The words broke like salt water. Emma spoke again, her voice small but unmistakable. "Will you come back?" She was asking Danielle. Not her father. Not the doctors. Danielle. The administrator offered immediate reinstatement. Back pay. A new position, Director of Combat Trauma Training and Veteran Integration, a role that didn't exist until that moment but needed to exist now. Danielle accepted quietly, the way she accepted everything, without drama, without tears, without letting the trembling in her hands show. 3 hours later, Dr. Hargrove entered his office into a box while security watched. The same guard who'd handed Danielle her belongings 2 days ago now handed Hargrove his own. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Hargrove didn't respond. Just walked toward the exit with the box and the terrible knowledge that everything he'd built had been constructed on sand and ego and the assumption that no one in that building could possibly be stronger than he was. 6 months later, Emma turned 8 in the hospital's family garden. She was running now, laughing in the way children do when the darkness finally releases them. Danielle stood at the edge of the garden in her white coat, her earned position, her reclaimed identity, watching the girl move through space like light. Commander Mitchell stood beside her, tears in his eyes like permanent fixtures. He'd told her everything about Kandahar. About the moment her son had stepped in front of him. About the 3 Marines who'd lived because of that choice. They'd begun, slowly, the work of sharing grief, 2 people who loved the same boy, finding in that love a reason to live differently. The Afghan translator was there, recovered from his MI, his family surrounding him. The SEAL team leader arrived with his squad, presenting Danielle with a gift, her old unit patch, framed, with a plaque, the Angel of Kandahar. As the party wound down and the sun turned the sky the color of old blood, Emma ran to Danielle and wrapped her arms around her waist. "Tell a story," she asked. Danielle sat surrounded by children and families and the wreckage of everything that had tried to break her. Mitchell beside her? Emma's small hand in hers. And she began to speak about warriors, not the ones in uniform, but the ones who showed up. The ones who didn't give up. The ones who fought every day to heal and hope and protect the vulnerable. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," Danielle finished quietly. Emma smiled. Light returned to her eyes. And somewhere in a strip mall across Norfolk, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table with insurance brochures and the knowledge that his entire world had been built on judging someone he'd never bothered to truly see. If you made it this far, you understand that real strength isn't announced, it's quietly lived. Subscribe for more stories about the ones who save us when we don't even know we're drowning. Like this video. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you actually were?